Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the TUC, which is about winning the argument and protecting jobs and pay. I'm Anna from the TUC, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Stephen from PCS and Harriet from Unite, and I'll be getting onto them in a second. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. We do have live captions for today's webinar. If you want to watch the live captions, please click the green button, which is underneath us, and you'll be able to open the transcript in a new window. It's great to see so many of you already saying hello in the chat panel on the right-hand side. Please use that to as I said, introduce yourselves, exchange ideas with each other, and my colleagues will be posting any resources or tips there throughout the webinar. And I'm delighted to say that today we've got someone joining us from South Africa, so it's a truly global event, which is great to see. If you've got any questions for Harriet or for Stephen, there's an Ask a Question button down at the bottom of the screen. Please post them there, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can in the time that we've got. I will say, though, that we aren't able to answer any very specific workplace questions, I'm afraid, but we'll try and give answer as many questions as we can that are more general. So we're going to start off by hearing from Harriet from Unite, and she's going to be talking to us about the work she's done to protect jobs and pay, and how within her union they've been able to persuade employers to think of alternatives to redundancies. So I'm going to hand over to you, Harriet, to get going.
Hi there, everybody. I can't actually see you all, so I'm talking into a bit of a void. So I'm looking forward to questions afterwards and any comments from you all. I'm a regional officer for Unite, based in Sheffield, and at the moment I cover a couple of different industrial sectors, people in the logistics industry, that's warehousing, and people who drive trucks and lorries from and to places, also higher education and education. So I also look after the two universities in Sheffield, and that's kept me very busy. I also have rail engineering, and I was asked to talk about redundancies, and because I can't see you and I'm not in a room with you all, normally I'd be saying how many of you have been dealing with redundancies, say as reps and shop stewards over the last 12 months. I'm assuming that a lot of you will have been doing that, but if you haven't, I'm sure you will be in the future, not least because of COVID. I don't know how overstated that was at the beginning, what we've been able to do in terms of protecting people's jobs or making employers think again. And with redundancies, it's often very difficult to do that, because typically with redundancies, you'll get an employer, and I'm not talking about COVID specifically, but in normal circumstances, you'll get an employer coming to you saying, we need to restructure. And it's always worth reminding yourself that redundancy is when the job or the role has actually ceased. But you'll get an employer coming to you in normal circumstances saying, we want to restructure, we've got to close, we want to make cuts. And the most important thing in those circumstances would be that you have to get that employer to explain coherently their rationale for that, so that it makes sense to you, and more importantly, it makes sense to the members, that they can understand why the employer is doing that. And it also gives you and the other reps the opportunity to actually challenge it and question it and say, well, is that the right response from the employer? Do you actually need to cut these jobs? Is there another way that you can do it? Is there another way that you can save money? Or and that's the importance of the union, to be able, through collective consultation, to be able to actually challenge the employer and say, look, you've gone for Armageddon, do we really need that? And can we do it differently? I don't want to kind of be here and lecture you, especially as you've probably been dealing with redundancies yourselves. But the law and the rules and the steps with redundancies take a fairly formulaic, or should be fairly formulaic, and set out a path that you can follow, and it's that collective consultation that gives the union an opportunity to do that. So yeah, I talked about the rationale. So in a case, a closure, and it's horrible when you end up talking about cases, because obviously they're people, they're our members, they're employees who have been given the worst possible employment news, and that is that your job is likely to be coming to an end and that they're facing redundancy. And it is really important always to remember that, and the impact that that's going to have on them and their families. And one such case in Sheffield recently was when a logistics firm called Trade Team, who deliver drinks to the drink industry, to pubs and clubs, said it was going to close. And we challenged that, and rightly so, because why did they choose that depot and not one of the other depots? And on that occasion, all the employee representatives, the shop stewards and the other employee representatives, got together to put forward a counter proposal. And in the end, the employer didn't bite with that. They said that we're going ahead with it. But it's really difficult to use your industrial might in circumstances where you've got COVID and everybody's furloughed. You can't threaten industrial action, but in normal circumstances, that is something, if your members are willing to do that and wanting to do that, industrial action is obviously something that you can consider. We have had specifically COVID-related redundancies, and over the summer we had Sheffield University go for what I would describe as the Armageddon option excuse me, by serving the HR1 form and saying that they were on the HR1 form that they were going to dismiss and re-engage people on lesser terms and conditions. That's what it amounted to. And we're not just talking about one faculty, one department, or one group. They included their 8,000 plus employees on that HR1 form. So we worked together with the other, the other unions there. And we worked very, very closely with the other unions, and we challenged what the university was saying, because in circumstances where you've got something like COVID, it is entirely possible for the employer to use that strategy, that tactic, to scare everybody. Because if you're faced with dismissal and being re-engaged on lesser terms and conditions, you might actually give consideration to volunteering for redundancy, or saying, oh yeah, I'll work 4 days a week instead of 5 days a week if that saves all our jobs. And I think that is an incredibly unfair way to treat your workforce. It creates tremendous anxiety, because everybody is basically being told you're going to lose your job unless you play ball with us and agree to lesser terms and conditions. There, in the end, the university did withdraw that threat, and that's a good thing, but it should never have happened like that in the first place. And it brings me back to the point about the employers should actually have a strategy. If they need to cut costs, if they genuinely need to cut costs, then they should have a thought through strategy. And there's a balance, isn't there, between that and attracting people to take voluntary redundancy. It might suit you if you're a couple of years off retirement, to have that little extra push and incentive to take voluntary redundancy. It might actually suit your members. You as a rep, you have to balance that. Your job in the end is to protect their jobs and to protect their terms and conditions, and through collective consultation, if they have to go, to get the best possible settlement for them, the best possible redundancy payment. And that can include a number of things. It can include, for example, all those employees, all your members who would normally not qualify because they've got less than 2 years service. You can, through collective consultation, negotiate a payment for them, and we were able to do that at Trade Team. Also at the university, as a separate employer, as a students' union, and there we had COVID-related restructuring because their income dropped. And again, it's incredibly important to challenge the financials and dig down. And if you yourself are not used to digging down into financial accounts, you can always, through your union, or particularly, I mean, quite often the best people to be able to do that are people who work for the organisation themselves and know through what they do at work what the true financial picture is. And it's worth getting hold of people like that so that you can drill down into that kind of detail. What else do I want to say about redundancy situations? I think it's incredibly important to communicate with your members at all times. And if necessary, well, not just if necessary, it's really important for you when you're doing your collective consultation to know what your members are thinking. And your members at any one time will be thinking different things from each other. So it's worth, and we did this at the university, both with the University of Sheffield employees and also with our members who worked for the student union. We surveyed them to get feedback from them on whether they felt under pressure, whether they felt stressed or anxious, whether they wanted voluntary redundancy, what was important for them. Were they able to survive on a 4-day week instead of a 5-day week? And we did that so that we would have the evidence to face to feed back to the employer and to face, to win our arguments, to be able to say to the employer that X% of your employees are saying they couldn't survive on 4 days a week instead of 5 days a week, or they couldn't afford to take a 20% pay cut. And we had that evidence, which is really, really powerful when you're having to argue your corner in collective consultation. So make sure you're communicating and getting that kind of feedback from your members and finding out whether they do want to get voluntary redundancy or not, whether they want to keep their jobs, whatever it is that they want. That's incredibly important. Communicating isn't just with your members. We often use press releases when we want to be quite open and frank about it, put pressure on the employer. And there's nothing better really, other than the threat of industrial action. There's nothing better than getting a good press release out that speaks both to your members and the employees, but also holds the employer to account in a very public way. There's nothing better to get their attention and get them to play ball. Another thing I must mention, when it comes to redundancies, we obviously work in teams within Unite with other departments, but the most important department at the end, when you haven't been able through the collective consultation process to avoid redundancies, is to bring in your union learn people. And I think out of today, if there's one thing that we do is that we make everybody aware that how important and how crucial union learn the organisers are from Union Learn, and that whole funding that's going to be cut by the government. It's incredibly important that we retain that and keep that going, because the success rate of Union Learn in managing to get people who are being made redundant into new jobs or upskilled so that they have a better prospect of getting into new jobs. That can't be understated. And so please, if you see the petition or you see anything about campaign to retain Union Learn, please make sure that you back that and support that, and that we do all we can to retain Union Learn. I've no idea, because I'm in a bit of a vacuum here. I've no idea whether I've gone over. I've not got a red light coming.
No worries at all, Harriet. I'm not timing you. I'm not going to mute you. Don't worry about that. So just a couple of things to recap on what Harriet was saying. She mentioned there union learning and the threats to the cut in the funding for union learning. And she mentioned the petition that is live at the moment to help campaign to change this decision. A link to that petition has just been posted in the chat, so do have a look at that. And if you haven't signed already, please do sign, because as Harriet said, Union Learning has done incredible work over the past 15 or so years. Hundreds of thousands of people have benefited from learning through their union, and at a time of national crisis that we're in at the moment, upskilling and reskilling has never really been more important. So Harriet, for now, I will we'll just hand over to Stephen for now, but I think I will come back to you to ask for some of your to detail some of the key tips that you mentioned. So now we're going to hand over to Steven Warwick from PCS to talk to us about some of the work he's done within PCS's cultural sector. I have got that right, haven't I? As you do say, PCS cultural sector, is it?
Yeah. So I am Steven. I'm the PCS Culture Group Secretary. So I oversee PCS's activities in the culture and heritage areas that are centrally publicly funded. So things like the British Museum, the National Gallery, the Tate, and areas like that. Yes, so I mean, I just wanted to start really by reiterating my colleague's view around, really getting into the details of the business case and around what the employer is planning to do. Our last sort of major dispute in the culture sector really was at the Tate and for their enterprise contracts. And in fact, one of the things we did manage to secure in a very robust way was they were planning on closing entirely the retail operations at Tate St Ives. And we were able to get them to reverse that decision simply through reviewing the business case and finding space where they could deliver a one-way shop, and really with the information from members that we had on site, we were able to do that, and that saved all of the jobs in retail at Tate St Ives. Obviously, as my colleague said, getting really stuck into the collective consultation is really important, and we found through the consultations that are ongoing at the moment in the culture sector in PCS, of which there are 9 for collective consultation redundancies, that the employer tries very often to get staff representatives on board as well as the union reps, which is an activity to try and divide the employee side. We have, in those sites where they've managed to do that, been sufficiently organised that when they seek employee representative elections, that we're able to get our reps elected into those posts anyway. And as an example, the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is currently going through a collective consultation for over 100 redundancies, they wanted a staff side, so an employee representative side of 12 employee reps, and the union side of only 3, and we managed to get all of our branch executive elected into those posts. So they gave up on that attempt to undermine the trade union. So it's just worth bearing in mind really how to kind of get ahead of the employer in those ways. I suppose that's where my presentation really then starts to deviate from my colleagues, who I think has given an excellent view on what to do while discussions are still going on. We have found in culture that the impact of the coronavirus has been enormous, and sort of almost unchallengeably enormous. The drop in visitor numbers to most of the national museums and galleries has been around 78%-ish, and they are running often between 18 and 25% of their expected visitor numbers. So most of the time, actually, we're unable to challenge the business case as an activity, and so that really leads us into what we do about trying to defend as many jobs as possible where the employer can justify their loss. And really, I suppose that takes us into kind of campaigns for redundancy. So the first thing I would say is clearly, as with everything, that's made far more difficult under the restrictions for coronavirus. And so a lot of this is going to be talking about the kind of alternative methods that we've tried and used, and hopefully colleagues will find them useful. And the first of those is WhatsApp, which I know is a kind of everyone's nightmare. I've got about 1 million WhatsApp groups that are terrible, but actually in terms of organising members and being able to discuss and talk to members about what was going on in their redundancy consultation, about organising what we might want to do, WhatsApp proved to be a much better tool than emails. The first thing is that many employees have got their own staff WhatsApp groups anyway for shift swaps and holiday cover and all of that kind of stuff, and so colleagues will have members will have each other's telephone numbers already, and we were able to very quickly set up WhatsApp groups by simply sending a blind WhatsApp broadcast out to everyone to say, do you want to be put in the union WhatsApp group? And as they replied, we just set them up. And in the take dispute, within 2 weeks, we had 98% of our members in one group, and we were able to communicate with them very effectively. After a couple of weeks, we did have to restrict who was able to post in that chat, just to make sure it was kind of an update from reps rather than a massive discussion forum, so things weren't lost. But the ability to, be able to message 98% of our members at once, quite with quite a degree of confidence, was really important, and more than ever important now that face-to-face meetings prove more difficult. As well as WhatsApp, clearly we've got other digital media, and we found of all of the kind of video platforms that Zoom actually was very useful. I'm not on Zoom's payroll, but what I find particularly good about it is that you can set it up in a gallery view, so you can see all of the people that are dialed into the call. And when you've got 100, 120, 150, 200 members on one call, kind of all lined up in little boxes, you can scroll through. People can see a sense of energy, and they can see a strength that the union has. Really importantly, rather than some of the other systems which just, like this one, show one speaker's big face and everyone else is kind of not easily visible. So we did a lot of meetings organised through WhatsApp on that platform in order to kind of galvanise members and to show them that the union was there, that we were strong, that we had the organisation to make a difference. So that in terms of how we organised in the world of coronavirus, those were our two key changes that we made. In terms of the campaigning itself around redundancies, I think the first lesson really was that we needed to set real, clear and understandable demands. And what I mean by that is not just, well, we don't want job losses, which is clearly the union's key demand, but something which is going to cut through a lot of the noise that we have at the moment with, huge economic upheaval and, lots of other demands on media time, particularly. So, that may well be a demand, like, then a full utilisation of the job support scheme, where employers are just not using it because they don't want to spend the extra 5%, or you might want to pull out senior salaries for CEOs and senior managers to say, we don't want any redundancies while anyone is paid more than, say, £100,000 or £150,000. And that really kind of makes it a concrete demand to say, we're not asking to say every single job needs to be saved here, because I think when we want to bring the public on board, that's a very difficult thing for people to accept and for us to justify. But it's much easier to say nobody should be made redundant while anyone is taking in huge salaries. The public have got sympathy with that, and we're asking for a legitimate sacrifice to carry the business forward, in effect, rather than our members paying the price, that those people who can most afford it pay the price. That being said, I think it's really important, once the demands are set, to manage expectations for members. I think not only manage the expectations in terms of what you might win, although clearly you don't want to demobilise members, but also the timescales that are involved in balloting. I mean, just from the legal framework, you're really looking at a minimum of 6 weeks before you can take any action from the day that you decide to ballot. But you have to then factor in some other time in terms of building that support, making sure that you will get the 50% threshold, making sure that you've got the relevant details, which I'll come on to in a short while, so that members, because we want to agitate members. But what I think we found with the tape particularly was we'd got members to a place where they were ready to take action, and then we found ourselves in a bit of a lull where we had a 6-week period where we couldn't really do a lot. And I think looking back on what we did in that campaign, it would have been really important for us to keep that momentum through that period and to make sure that everybody understood what was going on. some of the stuff that we can do during the kind of early stages of the collective consultation really is to have a consultative survey or consultative ballot. I think, again, my colleague mentioned really importantly about what members can or can't accept in terms of pay cuts or reductions of hours for the collective consultation. But we also had, when we do disputes in PCS, we launch surveys which ask members not only whether they're prepared to take action, and so making it a consultative ballot, but also for their information, so their job title, their name, where they work, so all of the ballot information that we might need for the ballot request, and really importantly as well, what activities they may want us to do. Now, most of them probably as activists and as officials we may be planning to do anyway, writing to local MPs, organising protests and days of action online and things like that. But we really found that by asking members, by giving them the options of saying, do you want us to do this, do you want us to do that, that they really had a sense of ownership of the campaign, and that it was really impactful, particularly during that period of lull that I mentioned, where you've decided to take the step and ballot for industrial action. To be able to say, we've done this, here's a draft letter that you asked us to write to send your MP, this is a day of protest that we've planned that you asked for, so members can really see that they are core to the union, and that what's being done by the union is what they've asked for and what they want to see being done. And I think a sense of ownership for all of these disputes is really important, not least because we're asking members to make those kinds of sacrifices. So all of that bearing in mind, we've got a ballot out, we've done all the stuff that members have asked us to do. With the ballot being won, we then really need to consider kind of tactics and how we are going to publicise what's going on, and how we are going to make sure that the dispute is as impactful as possible. Clearly, again, that's much more difficult where large-scale redundancies are being made, for the simple fact that employers don't need that many staff, and so is taking out 100 members when they only need 20 at work going to be impactful? The density of the union becomes incredibly important. But also, making sure that we are getting the level of public support that we need to fund the dispute, to make sure that members are not losing a huge amount of money to be able to sustain the dispute, and to apply pressure on the employer. And I absolutely agree that press releases are really important. But we also found, particularly in culture and in those sectors that have got quite an emotive value for staff, that social media platforms were really useful, especially in terms of tagging artists and other stakeholders that may well have much bigger reach. MPs challenging them as to why they've not supported stuff. We in culture, on the PCS culture account, we ran a Twitter takeover of our group account. So we got members to send us things that they wanted us to tweet out on their behalf, really coming from an individual place about their experience and stories, why they can't afford to lose their jobs, their own specific circumstances. We had young parents, we had people that were waiting on their immigration status, and they were concerned that not having a job was going to cause them difficulties there. So some really important and really vital stories for us to kind of get the news out, and we found that was hugely successful, particularly in terms of generating press interest. The other thing which generated quite a lot of press interest was really members getting quite creative with tweeting. I think sometimes as institutions we can be a little bit shy about about some tweets, rightly so, and so having a kind of a member run Twitter, which we got kind of relative control over but not direct control, was useful, because we could do things which were a bit more interesting than maybe the National Union was keen to do. And so one thing that we did do was one of our members at the Tate put an exhibition note, one of those little white placards which tells you what the exhibit you're looking at is, and they put one of those next to a urinal in the Tate Gents toilets, which parodied the fountain exhibition, which is currently in the Turbine Hall, and that the caption read that this was an upside down fountain to show how the Tate were pissing away 313 staff, and that received about 200,000 views and tens of thousands of interactions and engagements, and was a really important thing for members to see that we were getting the word out there, and that people were invested and engaged in our campaign. And of course, as I mentioned, digital meetings were really important so that we could share that news and make sure that members could see each other in a world where they're otherwise not able to do that, and could see the support that they have. We invited guest speakers, politicians, artists, people from other trade unions, people from the TUC to come along and to really give their support. And it really galvanised members as we went into the campaign. And I mean, of course, that's got to sit next to some more classic campaigning stuff. News outlets clearly have a huge impact beyond the reach of what we could do in social media. And we as a union worked really hard to get the story out there and were covered by lots of news organisations. I don't know whether to be ashamed or otherwise, but including the Daily Mail, which was not one of my favourite interviews that I've ever given, but nevertheless, we told them about our dispute. And really a lot of that was brought up by the members' stories, and we decided early on that we would have a line to take from the union. We would make sure that everybody was on message in terms of the core demands, and that, you know, the demands that we set resonated with people. But what seems to generate a lot of press interest and a lot of people wanting to become involved and support our campaign was around those personal stories from members. And so it's really important early on to identify members who are confident and willing to kind of speak out and speak about their experiences, even on an anonymized basis, importantly, but just so that we can get a bit of a personal interest in what's going on, because clearly at the moment there are lots of economic issues and there will be lots of people that are going to be struggling in terms of work. And I think what we can't do is allow the government to kind of turn what is a huge human impact into just numbers that they bound about in Parliament. And so, you know, it's part of the responsibility of a union to really make sure that our members' stories are getting out there. Face-to-face protests clearly are getting harder, although we did do them for the Tate, and I know that the Royal Academy is also doing them for their like a programme of events for this week. For the Tate, we had a ballet dancer come down and do some performances on the outside the Turbine Hall entrance. We had living art projects where you know, our members performed. We had political speakers, we had book readings from authors, we had events, you know, design your own protest banner and things like that to kind of get people that were queuing up to go into the Tate involved and importantly donating to our strike fund. And also, you know, we made sure that we had really digitized a lot of the information that we gave out. So we had big posters and placards with QR codes on them that people could scan while they're standing in the queue on their phones, rather than handing out leaflets. We made sure that our strike donation was online rather than necessarily buckets where people are going more and more cashless. And again, we linked that with a QR code. You know, really importantly, we made sure that we had lots of disinfectant and lots of hand sanitizer and sanitizing spray for all of the equipment that we used, you know, microphones, sound equipment and stuff like that. So, you know, I think just that extra step in terms of making sure that regardless of where we are with COVID, that people are safe and secure. But I think a physical presence is still really important, and we can be creative in terms of how we maximise the impact of that. I think, you know, had we been able to get 10,000 people together, that would have been amazing. But the public interest that we had when we were doing, you know, the Living Art project, where there was, you know, music and people being there was some yarn and, you know, people being tied together and all that kind of stuff was I think almost as impactful as we could get under the circumstances. And I think finally, I'm just going to say, I think although it seems like I'm ending on a bit of a down note, I think it's really important that we bear in mind and that we manage members' expectations that for large scale redundancies like the ones we're seeing, I think we will really struggle as unions to secure everybody's job. I think even if most CEOs, although some are, you know, have extreme salaries, did take those big pay cuts, we would not be able to stave off a position where organisations are able to sustain their current staffing levels. Clearly, our view is we need to save as many jobs as possible, and as a union, PCS has a position where we oppose rightly all compulsory redundancies. And so all of that stuff my colleague mentioned earlier on about voluntary packages and consultations and the business cases are really important. But I think what we need to do is make sure that we also reiterate that what we're doing is part of a wider campaign, that the government has failed in this case and is not supporting business like it should, is not supporting certain sectors like it should, and that there are lots of wins that we can get alongside securing jobs which are, you know, equally as valid, and make sure that those gains are passed on to the rest of the sector. So in the Tate, for example, we managed to secure some extra redundancy enhancements for the majority of staff being made redundant. That was in the end, an additional 2 months on top of their redundancy payments. That was a 1 month voluntary payment, and then we secured an extra month through the dispute. That included those under 2 years of service. And we also got additional recruitment and ring fencing for any posts which come available across the whole of the Tate estate, including their additional outsourced contracts. Once we'd secured that and we were voting on whether to accept that or not, we had other redundancies at the South Bank Centre, and all of a sudden when we went into dispute, they provided us with a similar arrangement to the one that we had at the Tate and increased the redundancy pay and agreed much more preferential redeployment and re-engagement terms. So, you know, employers talk to each other, particularly across sectors, and it was really important, you know, that we're seeing across the culture sector that the institutions are coming to us now as they're making redundancies with the improvements already built in that we managed to secure at the Tate. And so, you know, that the battle that we had at the Tate, while it didn't secure as many jobs as we might have wanted and had campaigned for, had a real impact. And I think it's really important to reiterate that to members, because I think some of the worst thing would be, you know, us amping everybody up and making them ready for what is a bitter and difficult time in industrial action, and then not winning everything and members walking away thinking that the union had failed or that they had not done a great job. And so, you know, it's just to bear in mind but how those wins can be recreated and pushed out into the wider sector. Clearly, you know, redundancies are really hard to win. The employer doesn't need huge numbers of staff, which weakens our industrial strength. But you know, we need to make sure that we are campaigning, that we are being loud and you know, opposing all of these changes, whether or not we win every battle at a local level or not. As much noise as the trade union movement can make and trade unions individually can make across sectors is really important, because really, you know, what's going to carry us through any kind of crisis of this scale and size in terms of its impact on the economy is not going to be individual business, but it's going to be direct intervention by the government. And, you know, this government has shown itself over the past months not to do anything unless they're forced to do it kicking and screaming. And, you know, we are the voice of the workers' movement. And you know, I think it's incumbent on us to do that and to make sure that we are fighting as much as possible, whether we win individual disputes or not, to apply as much pressure as we can on a real and you know, robust medium and long-term financial solution to make sure that thousands, if not millions, of people, working people, are not made redundant. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Stephen. I think from both you and from Harriet, we had some fantastic ideas, examples of things that you could do, that people can do in workplaces who, when they are in dispute or fighting the employer about redundancies and how to protect jobs and pay. I want to just highlight a couple of things before we take questions, and things that I think that are particularly helpful for people who might be in similar situations, was about collecting evidence from members to use in your arguments and your negotiations. Harriet, I think you mentioned that you surveyed your membership, and that gave you some really great information that you could present to the employer during negotiation. You both mentioned good comms, be that face-to-face meetings, although obviously we can't have so many of them at the moment, but WhatsApp, other digital meetings are always really important. But I think another really key thing is about, when dealing with members, about helping them to have an ownership of the activity that you're having. And Stephen, you particularly mentioned this about how getting them on board, especially during that lull period between perhaps a ballot and action, or keeping people engaged and having them have ownership, helps to manage their expectations, which I think would be key throughout. So let's take a look at some of the questions that the audience have been posting. And while I'm just opening those up, it's great to see so many people as well have signed and shared the petition to save union learning, which we posted in the chat a little while ago. So thanks very much for doing that. And if you haven't, please do check that out as well, because it's a fantastic campaign. So we've had quite a few questions around a similar theme about mini restructuring or changing of terms and conditions. So perhaps you can both speak a little about this, and we'll come to you first, Harriet, to give Stephen a little bit of a rest. But what things can you say about a mini restructure or a change in terms and conditions when you're in this situation of negotiating around jobs and pay?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention that, but in fact, that is that happens an awful lot. It's the salami slicing, the little tranches where you don't have 30 plus or 90 plus employees affected. So if the union can get in there and talk to the management, even though effectively you don't have the normal collective consultation rights, it's incredibly important. The reps need to get in there and still push the management and challenge the employer over the rationale. If they're getting rid of 7 heads, you know, just to pluck that's what it usually amounts to, isn't it? 7 or 17 employees potentially affected. You've got to get in there and put exactly the same arguments that you would in those larger collective consultation meetings, and you know, the employer in employment law holds all the cards. But then again, so do you as the reps, because you've got the knowledge, you know how it works, you know what the impact will be if they get rid of those 7 people, you know what the impact will be on others. And by the way, I did, there was a comment in the chat box which caught my eye, which was also about the impact of stress on people. It's that long, anxious wait to find out whether you're going to be selected for redundancy, whether it's you or somebody else. It's awful for anybody that's been through that kind of anxiety and stress that you go through. And then at the other end, when you've lost colleagues to redundancy, you then potentially have more work to do. And at the Students' Union in Sheffield, that's one of the first things on the first agenda after the redundancies, after the restructuring, was what are you going to do to support people? What are you going to do to assess the impact of this whole process that we've just been through and what is happening now on people? What are you going to do about it? And I think that's incredibly important, that you don't, once you've been through a redundancy phase, whether it's big or relatively small, that you follow up on that afterwards and make sure it isn't just that awful chapter that we never talk about when they had redundancies in 1978. It's the onward impact on it, and we must never lose that. So I don't know whether that answers the question.
Absolutely. I often refer to that as a redundancy process affects those who lose their jobs, but also those who don't. And it's about those members who remain as well as those who leave. So yeah, absolutely, about considering everybody in that process. Stephen, have you got anything to add about mini restructuring or negotiations around terms and conditions changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, it is very much something the employer does. Particularly, they will say, well, to save from redundancies, we're going to have to make these changes, and you know, they start eroding terms and conditions away. Sometimes that's a very difficult argument to win with members, particularly with the employer pointing out, you know, the difficulties they're having. We have approached, in certain, as an example, that the royal households, so the Queen's staff, they're trying to cut their pensions there, and we've had disputes with them. But what's really important is, again, to kind of show the disparity, to say, well, actually the members that are likely to lose terms and conditions are probably some of the worst terms and conditions in the institution anyway. And, you know, again, say, well, what about, you know, particularly senior staff salaries? Where can we save money? And, you know, challenge the kind of business case involved. The other thing that we have done at the Royal Palaces is we have agreed in principle, not to pensions reductions, but in a different case, to a kind of a 6 months deviation to the terms and conditions, which would then revert back after 6 months, so that we can sort of gather some of the member support in terms of members saying, well, we do want to save jobs, and so we're willing to accept this. But from the union's position, that what we don't want is for this to be an excuse to undermine terms and conditions indefinitely, and for us to kind of have to, you know, be forced backwards 2 steps from COVID, you know, forever. So we've said, all right, well, while we're assessing the actual impact of the virus and looking to recover, we will agree to a deviation to their terms and conditions with a robust clause in there to say it will go back to normal for renegotiation in 6 months' time. And yeah, I think somebody's mentioned there, you know, an equality impact assessment is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to mention that as well, an equality impact assessment, and whether we would at what stage in the process would you have that? Would you have it during negotiations before redundancies and possibly afterwards, depending on who was remaining? What would you consider, more than one? Sorry, Harriet, did you maybe you had your thoughts on that?
What that I didn't...
on the equality, when about an equality impact assessment in a redundancy process, would you do one before or one after or both, or any other thoughts on those?
It's something we quite often say. Have you done an equality impact assessment? And we often say that during collective consultation. Do you know what the impact of this will be? Will you be left with more men than women, more whatever? How is it? Is it going to have a worse impact on whichever group it is? We always say that whether they do one or not. It's one of those things you raise with the employer to highlight the fact that they might not have thought this through properly. What's it going to be like afterwards? Is it going to be a whole lot worse? Is it going to be fair? Is it going to be equal? And that's why you raise it during usually the collective consultation.
Sure, thank you. There's lots of people commenting in on the chat. I'm trying to read some of them as they're going by. There's some really good points. I wanted to put another question to you both, because we're sort of speeding through the hour here, and I wanted to try and answer another couple of questions. In your experience, what would be your advice and your top tips if you're in a situation in a workplace where there's more than one recognised union? Harriet, you touched on it briefly at the beginning, so perhaps you want to go first, and then Stephen, if you've got any experience as well, we'll come to you. I think you mentioned universities, Harriet, where you've got more than one union.
Yeah, and also I'm going to meet head on Ian, who from the RMT, who put in a question about what happens when, in his example, Unite told RMT at DB Cargo to get stuffed. I really hope that that's not in my allocation, because I'm not aware of that. Quite often you have more than one union. Well, coming back to the universities, we have mostly distinct bargaining groups, so I suppose it's easier. So if Unite is looking after technical staff and UCU are looking after lecturers, we're not competing with each other. But where you've got, and at the university we've all worked pretty well together, but coming back to a workplace like in rail engineering, where we may well have more than one union with recognition in representing the same bargaining group, it's incredibly important that you get on and talk to each other. So I'm going to check on my allocation to make sure that wasn't happening in mine. It may well be that two unions don't agree on a way forward, but it makes it all the more important that they do, because it's only going to be bad for the employees afterwards, isn't it? Because the employer will exploit any division like that, and they'll play you off against each other, and they'll say, we'd always loved working with Unite, let's get rid of the RMT and de-recognise them. And in my book, over at WabTech in Doncaster, we've worked really well together, the RMT and Unite, and you have to, because like I say, the employer will play you off against each other. So Ian, if there's any way that you can email me, it's harriet.eisner@unitetheunion.org. Get in touch and I'll have a look into that one. And there was a question about employee representatives. Sometimes in an organisation like Complete Closure of a Depot, we'll be representing all the people in our bargaining group, but there'll be other whole groups of workers that aren't employees that aren't represented by us, and they have to have their employee representatives. And again, you just have to make sure that that works in collective consultation.
Thanks, Harriet. Ian, if you are still online, Harriet, let you know her email address there. We'll put it in the chat as well, just so you can see it. So Stephen, in your workplaces, have you got any experience of there being more than one recognised union, and what advice would you have?
Yes, so most of PCS organised areas have got 2 other trade unions, Prospect and FDA. There are a couple where I've got Unite, the South Bank Centre being one. Across most of them, there is a reasonable division about where we organise. PCS tend to be front of house, more operational, functional jobs. Prospect tend to organise more professional, sort of curatorial type functions, and FDA tend to organise senior leaders, but that's not always the case, and there is some overlap. I mean, in terms of the South Bank, where it was very mashed about, we all represented anyone really, and PCS and Unite are broadly the same size. We had an excellent relationship, and that was really important. In effect, it doubled when we were saying the same thing with the same voice. It doubled the effectiveness of each union, because we in effect doubled our membership by having Unite or PCS, whichever side of the fence you sat on, reiterating exactly what you said. And so really coordinating across in old money, a trade union side structure to make sure that you could get as many single table positions as possible was really useful. Where we have more political differences, which I think probably more so with Prospect and FDA, we try and do that, and we try and really capitalise on the areas where we have got significant agreement, and where we haven't, we just make it clear. But it's important that we, in those discussions, I think where you have got a bit of political difference, that you try and establish which union is going to be kind of not speaking for, but which union has kind of got precedence for a certain cohort of staff, to make sure that you are speaking on behalf of your largest chunk of membership. Really, where that's not possible, my view would be try and thrash it out amongst yourselves, because it's never good looking divided in front of management. In terms of employee reps, I think it depends on the circumstances. Some areas where you've only got recognition in certain parts of the business and they're resisting in others, employee reps can be a massive pain. Some businesses just have staff councils to run alongside the trade union structure anyway, and that is problematic. And again, I don't want to say seek to undermine, but we ensure that we are sufficiently organised where that is the case, to make sure that our members, who are a majority of members in those groups, vote and elect their representatives or a PCS representative onto each of those constituent bodies, because the management need to know that there is one group of people that speak for staff, and that is the trade unions, and we carry that strength. I know somebody's just put in there about the equality impact assessments and the public sector equality duty, which is really important. And on equality impacts, very, very briefly, we found lots of employers try to really restrict them in terms of what impact it has in the group at risk, and really focus in so they could demonstrate that actually with the cohort of staff they're looking at, there's not a massive equality disparity. But as soon as you took that a step back and said, all right, let's look at the whole team, or let's look at the whole employer group, the equality impact became much more stark. And the reality is most redundancies at the moment are falling in the groups that are the lowest paid, and unfortunately, and for lots of awful and historic reasons, those groups are often overrepresented by disabled BME and women colleagues. And so actually, for example, at the Tate, within the group that were being made redundant in Tate Enterprises, BME colleagues were being made redundant at the same rate as everybody else. But when you looked at the Tate, 40% of the BME colleagues across the whole of the museum were in that one staffing group. And so actually the impact on equality across the estate was massive, but they really tried to crush us down into that little box to make the equality impact look much less stark. So it's really important that the union does that work and make, looks at the employer as a whole, because you'll find that the groups of staff that you're dealing with are likely to be overrepresented by those protected characteristic groups.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point, Stephen, about looking at it across the board rather than in that one particular group. Okay, so time has really flown by. We've been doing the webinar now for very nearly an hour. So it just remains for me to thank Harriet and Stephen very much for joining us today. I think it's been really helpful. We've heard about some fantastic campaigns, both run by Unite and by PCS, and we've learned lots of tips and ideas about how we can put this into practice and get the best for our members. So we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon. We've got our next webinar. We're just in the process of agreeing it at the moment, but it's not yet available to register for. But please do check out other webinars that are available from Union Learn at the moment, on a range of issues to do from digital skills, mentoring, and retraining and that sort of thing. You can find those at crowdcast.io/TUC, where you can see all our upcoming webinars registered. So we'll see you again for another webinar. Have a good rest of the week, and please stay safe. It's bye from us for now.